Order. Well, welcome everybody to this one-off session of the Environmental Audit Committee, looking at the issue of ancient woodlands. I'm pleased to say we have two excellent panels to assist us with our deliberations today. Our first panel comprises of Nick Phillips, Katharine, Flach and Dr. Keith Kirby. If I could start by just asking you to introduce yourselves and your organisations and your involvement in the ancient woodlands issue. And start with yourself, Mr. Phillips, if I may.
Hi, I'm Nick Phillips. I lead on forestry policy for the Woodland Trust. Ancient woodlands is kind of one of the core reasons Woodland Trust was created. A lot of our work is about managing our estate, which includes a lot of ancient woodland. We also do policy work and outreach work for advisors, so those who own ancient woodlands and how to restore them. So a big part of our charitable work is around ancient woodlands.
Thank you very much, Ms. Flach.
Hello, I'm Katharine Flach. I'm currently a Biodiversity Data Officer at the Thames Valley Environmental Record Centre, which is an accredited local environmental record centre. But I was previously at the Wildlife Trust for Beds, Cams and Northants, and I was working as the Ancient Woodland Inventory Officer as part of the National Inventory Update.
Excellent. Dr. Kirby.
I'm Keith Kirby. I'm a researcher in the University of Oxford's Department of Biology. But before that, I was Forestry and Woodland Officer with Natural England, Stroke English Nation Nature Conservancy Council for 30 years, and involved in that time with setting up the ancient woodland inventories to start with. But a lot of my research more recently has been in Whiteham Woods, which is a mixture of ancient and recent woodland, and looking at the changes in that. Brilliant.
Well, you have to say, Dr. Kirby, you look exactly like I would hope that a visiting professor from Oxford University studying woodland would. So I'm thrilled with your appearance on this committee, and obviously we have an excellent panel to take us through these issues. Can I start with you, Dr. Kirby, as a sort of scene setter? Can you just explain for the benefits of those watching why ancient woodland is unique and why it's so important?
Ancient woodlands, which are nominally defined as woods from about that have existed since at least 1600 in England, are the richest in terms of biodiversity. They have a long cultural history because they've almost all been managed and part of local communities for that time. They're also often fantastically beautiful as well. And the key thing is that there are various features of them, a lot of the species, some of the soil characteristics, some of the structures that are found in them that are rarely found in woods that have developed in the last century or so. So that in the late 1970s, which were a rather different time, woods were being commonly cleared for agriculture, for purposes at about 500 hectares or so a year. Many others were being cleared and replanted with coniferous crops. And we wanted a way of, in a sense, an alert system that would say, this wood is somewhat special, and don't just nod it through and let it go under the plough or under a blanket of Norway spruce. And that was, in a sense, what initiated the development of the ancient woodland inventories.
Thank you very much. Mr. Phillips, can you just talk us through, from your perspective, the current state of ancient woodland in England and how it is identified?
Sure. So it covers, even though it's so important, we've only got about 2.8% of England is ancient woodland currently. In terms of its condition, there's not a specific data set just for ancient woodland, but we do have something called the National Forestry Inventory, which looks at native woodland condition as a whole, and that showed only 9% of our native woods are in good ecological conditions. That means they're healthy, and it's quite likely that ancient woodlands are quite similar in terms of health. And when we talk about ancient woodlands, there are two main categories. So there's intact ancient semi-natural woodland, and there's also something called plantation on ancient woodland sites. And so in the latter category, these are still ancient woodlands, but during the 50s and 60s, quite large areas of ancient woodland were converted into timber plantations, and that was because back then there was a real need for more timber. There was a big drive after world wars for more wood, so this wasn't sort of done with bad intentions. Back then the value of ancient woodland was not fully recognised, and so we've now got an inheritance effectively of about 40% of our overall ancient woodland is what's known as plantation on ancient woodland sites. But I think the really key point is that it's still ancient woodland and it's still irreplaceable, it's just damaged.
And I mean, is that different definition a helpful one, do you think, or is it in danger of sort of muddying the waters or sort of confusing?
I think it really is important. I mean, for policy, for grants, for regulation, for rules, I think it's really important we have these different categories so that we can, for grants, for example, there are very specific grants that are required for these damaged plantation ancient woodland sites, and if we didn't have a clear inventory of where they were, that would be quite hard to enable those landowners to apply. These rules sometimes can seem quite arbitrary in terms of we have to define ancient woodland in quite a simple way, but the importance of that is it then allows you to put protection on them and incentivise landowners in the right way, because if we don't know where they are, it's very hard for government to design systems, guide rails around them to ensure they're cared for.
And Ms. Flach, in terms of how Britain's ancient woodland is currently being cared for, what would you say about the current standard of stewardship and the state that it's in right now?
So I'd say...
Sorry, that was to Ms. Flach, if you don't mind.
I'm not sure I'm best qualified to say about the state. I can talk about how it's recognised and how it's... Yes, I think I would pass that one over.
How it's defined.
Yes.
Well, do you want to answer that, and then we'll go back to Mr. Phillips for that one?
For the ancient woodland inventory, which is the list and maps of the ancient woodland sites, those are designed and they're from old maps going back from epoch. OS Epoch 1 maps, but tracing back towards the 1600s as far as can be shown to find that they are woodlands, and often prior to 1600 as well, because many of these ancient woodland sites show up in estate maps predating that date.
Okay, thank you. We'll explore that in more detail in a moment. But Mr. Phillips, come back to that question. How is the ancient woodland in England being cared for, and what's the health of the estate, do you think, in this view?
I would say it's a mixed picture, but incredibly daunting in terms of where we need to be right now in terms of ensuring that ancient woodland has got a future, because we've not got very much of it left. Some of the surveys that looks at native woodland condition as a whole gives us a quite clear point at what some of the key threats and reasons for their poor health are, and so they've gone through quite a kind of change in terms of their management over history. So they have been quite intensively managed in the past, and we're now in a period where large areas of ancient woodland are not managed for anything, be that for timber, be that for wildlife, be that for access. And what you're getting is what is an incredibly complex habitat, and the thing that makes it so special is the diversity, dead wood, ancient trees, and these incredibly complex but really vital and irreplaceable relationships between all of the nature within that wood. But as they become more simple and they haven't been managed, those woodlands have become basically less structurally diverse. In terms of government, there's some really, I would say England's probably got the best targets out of all the 4 countries in terms of ancient woodland restoration, really ambitious to bring the majority into restoration by 2030. In terms of progress, I would struggle to think of a worse performing environmental target. It's tricky because the level of data on how much ancient woodlands are being brought into restoration is not fully there. But the data we do have suggests we're probably around the 1% mark in terms of contribution to the overall target. I think what has been publicly reported, for example, on plantation on ancient woodland sites, we know those are some of the most at risk, is 1 year, I think about 3 years ago, was 6 hectares in the whole of England on private ownership was reported. The year after that, 1 hectare, so that's 1 football pitch. We needed to be more around about 5,000 hectares each year to meet government's target. I think it's fair to say, though, that those data, it's well known they're not fully accurate. It's likely that we are restoring more across England, but we're nowhere near the target. And these are our most important ancient woods. We're probably the generation that's going to decide their future. We're doing some great things on tree planting, but if we don't care for the most important woods we've already got, that suggests we haven't got the policy quite right.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Katharine.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to drill down into definitions before we move on from that entirely. So we've heard as a committee that it can be quite difficult to demonstrate that woodland sites date back to 1600 because of the quality of the maps. And I understand that Natural England has proposed that it could be worth granting equivalent permissions to younger woods from 1893. So I guess a science question first is how old does a wood have to be to develop the distinctive features that we're discussing? Is there a substantial ecological difference between a wood from 1600 and a wood from 1850, say?
It depends. Any wood can start to acquire species quite quickly, depending on its size, its location, and how it is being treated. So there are woods which we know from clear map evidence didn't exist before 1800, but nevertheless contain species that we'd otherwise normally associate with much older woods. Mm-hmm. But particularly if they've grown up, for example, on unimproved meadows. Not where we necessarily want new woodland now, but in the past that happened, and some of the species carried over into the woods.
Okay.
So they can acquire them. It depends also on where you are in the country. In most of lowland England, eastern England through into East Anglia through to southern Yorkshire, the woods tend to be isolated in fairly intensive farmland, and in those circumstances, if a new woodland develops, it's unlikely that many specialist species will move in. Mm-hmm. If you've got a new woodland developing in somewhere like the Weald, where you've got lots of ancient woodland all around and ancient hedges, then it's quite likely that some of those species will move in quite quickly. So you can show that on average, if you like, ancient woodlands are richer, have more of these rarer species than recent woodlands, but there is a zone of overlap.
Okay, that's helpful. And can I have the views of the panel on Natural England's proposal of granting the same protections to younger woods from 1893 as they suggest?
I can see why they would wish to, as I imagine they get a lot of pushback from developers when there is poorer evidence for woodland. I'd say for most woodlands you can date it to older than their ancient woodlands. You can date to older than the date they are suggesting, quite regularly back to at least sort of 1700. And I think there were only less than 2% of the woods that I gave back to Natural England as saying they were natural woodland that I was unhappy with the level of precise sort of ancient woodland characteristics and mapping evidence. Besides that, I'd say they were actually quite well demonstratable. I I do agree with what the professor is saying in that there are certainly an overlap in some older non-ancient woodlands do have a lot of ancient woodland characteristics, but then also there are the historic, the archaeological and the sort of social ancient woodland characteristics as well, which are also important and not found in later plantations and natively occurring later woodlands. And in increasing the ancient woodland definition to include later woodland, I would be concerned that it might decrease the perceived value of the ancient woodlands which date to 1600 and prior to that. So that would be my concern with that.
I guess, yeah, I mean, similar. I think I would view it as almost like a hierarchy where we need to protect a whole range of woodland types, but it should be based on their value. I mean, the key thing for ancient woodland is it's totally irreplaceable. So once it's gone, there's no policy or grant that's going to bring it back. And so just from a policy point of view, it's sensible to put the greatest protection on that. And I think the key thing to kind of remember with ancient woodland, a lot of the species can move in some cases as far as this desk. I mean, they're unlike some of the bird species, a lot of species are highly immobile, and it's not just about the species, it's about the complex relationships they've built up with each other, which you can't just recreate. And so whilst we might get some species colonising these newer woodlands, they'll never ever replicate the ancient woodland. So I think I would see it as a hierarchy where we should have protection for long-established woodland, but ultimately we should be having the top protection for ancient woodland, which currently it doesn't have even that. But
thank you.
Thank you very much. Sir John Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. So we are discussing ancient woodland as if it were all one thing. Can the panel explain what are the common features of ancient woodlands? And we know that this ancient woodland make is huge beneficial for the environment. So would the size of the woodlands, the location, and the management make any difference to on environmental impact?
Yes, very much so. They tend to have particular structures so often associated with their past management, so that the woods will often have been managed as coppice, where the trees were cut very regularly on a 20 to 30 year time scale and then allowed to regrow from the stumps. But the other factors, such as size, are important. Any woodland, the bigger it is, the more likely it is to contain a wider range of species and more species, and that's particularly true for ancient woods. Where it is in the country, there are some woods which are naturally poorer than others because of the nature of the soils. So that if you were looking at a wood in Cumbria, acid rocks, you would not expect the same range of species as you would find in a boulder clay wood in East Anglia. They would be different species, and so they would still be the characteristic species, but only a limited number of them.
Thank you. Anyone on the other panel want to?
I think there's a good point to flag on ancient woodland is there's a perception that they're ancient trees, if it's dominating them, but actually the level of ancient trees within ancient woodlands is often quite low sometimes, but it's because they've been managed quite heavily in the past and still are in some cases. But the thing that I think that makes them so important, so special, as I keep coming back to really, is the kind of relationship between the whole wood. It's about seeing the wood for the trees. It's just a bit of an overused phrase, but a lot of the carbon, most of the biodiversity is actually in the soil. And so, but traditionally policy and science evidence is really focused just on the tree element. And so it's really important, if we're going to truly value ancient woodlands, as we're now realising more widely about soil, it's actually often beneath your feet that's the kind of most irreplaceable bit. But to give you kind of a flavour for kind of the size of the sites as well. Looking at the plantation on ancient woodland sites, so that's about 40% of ancient woodlands, about 50% is less than about 3.5 football pitches in size, so less than 3.5 hectares. So quite a lot of it is quite small and fragmented. But we are doing a lot of woodland creation, tree planting now, so there's a real opportunity for policy to kind of join the dots there, where we want to try and buffer, make them bigger, connect them up, and that's good for resilience and good for the species as well. But yeah, I think from a policy point of view, it's really, really important that we don't lose any more, even though it is quite still fragmented.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ross Savage.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Phillips, I'd like to direct this question at you first, but I'd also very much welcome the input of the other panellists, because it follows on quite well from what you've just been saying. You mentioned there that a lot of the biodiversity of wood is in the soil. So I'm wondering if there is, and I realise there are a lot of other variables as well, like how well it's been managed, but I'm wondering if there are any broad brushstrokes generalisations that can be made about how the ecological benefits of plantations on ancient woodland sites compare to actual ancient and semi-natural woodland.
Yeah, I would view them as they're both types of ancient woodland, and both will have features that are irreplaceable that make them ancient woodland, such as ancient trees, veteran trees, dead wood, some of the soil fungi. There'll be things that you can't repeat, but I would view plantation and ancient woodland sites as damaged and degraded. So in many cases, and there are in England, there are kind of two main kind of species, really, I guess, or types of tree. It's both conifer, non-native conifer was often planted on them, but equally a lot of broadleafed plantation was also created, particularly in places like the southeast. And the actual biodiversity on those sites is quite dependent on the management. So there can be some sites that still have quite a lot of conifer on them, but have been managed by continuous cover forestry, a type of forestry system where you effectively maintain a canopy of trees. But there are some sites which is more typical, which is a forestry in the UK, which is where you clear fell the site and then you replant. And that is incredibly damaging from an ancient woodland point of view. And those are the ones probably I would say are most at risk. Because every time you clear fell, you're exposing the whole ecosystem, which is used to being under trees, not suddenly exposed to the summer temperatures we're getting now. And then secondly, once that plantation's grown up, if you go into one of these sites, you would see that often it's incredibly dark in some cases, and those the community is used to deciduous trees, so trees that drop their leaves, and suddenly they're not getting those seasons at all. And so the ecology of the wood is breaking down. I think we've shown on a lot of parts of our estate, and many large estates and landowners, including Forestry England as well, have shown you can bring these sites back, and it takes time. I think it's not about kind of getting rid of the non-native trees as quickly as you can. In actual fact, that used to be how I think people thought it was done, but actually what they showed was if you change the site too quickly, again, you've got this kind of ecosystem which is already damaged and unhealthy, and you're suddenly exposing it to light and everything. So actually I would say there's a rush to start restoration, but not a rush to finish.
Very helpful, thank you. Ms. Flach.
I would second what was said before, but also point out that a lot of the ancient woodland species and characteristics, they have thrived for centuries in the management styles of the past, which is things like coppicing smaller sections of the woodland, which is why the clear felling and replanting is damaging to them.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kirby.
Yeah, the key is how much the soil is disturbed, so that clear felling of a few hectares, even a few tens of hectares at times, if it's done carefully and with extraction, again, without too much soil disturbance, may in some cases be mimicking the past coppice management. But equally, quite small fells, but with heavy disturbance through extraction, can be damaging. So it's that level of damage associated with the felling that is important.
Got it. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Chair. It would be really helpful, I think, for us as a committee to get a fuller understanding of the threats to ancient woodlands. So I wonder if I could ask each of you to be as comprehensive as possible on the threats that ancient woodlands face. Starting with Mr. Phillips and then sideways.
Yeah, so whenever I try and list out the threats of ancient woodland, I could talk a long time, because unfortunately, whenever we seem to have come up with a list, there's another one added. But the list is quite long and is evolving. So one of the big threats for all woodlands, but in particular ancient woodlands, is deer populations, so overbrowsing by deer. And so where we've got native species of deer, we've also got introduction of non-native species of deer, which would have had natural predators. Those natural predators are no longer here, and so what we're seeing is large populations of deer growing, and that's effectively stopping the wood regenerate and also browsing off some of the woodland flora. Both a lack of management and also inappropriate management. I think we're seeing both ends of the spectrum. I think that's because of in some cases, the lack of markets, grants and guide rails, rules, regulations to drive the right activity is a key challenge. Pest and disease, so ash dieback will be very familiar, huge impact on our woodlands, and looking at some of the graphs on the level of pests and diseases that are coming into the UK, it is accelerating. Pollution's another one, so particularly nitrogen. So these soils are really delicate, and suddenly they're getting more nitrogen coming into them from outside of the system, which is changing the ecology of the wood. And you think about our ancient woodland soils, they're one of the few soils we've got which haven't had kind of heavy application of fertilisers, pesticides and so forth. So although they are not necessarily untouched, they are a lot more protected than some agricultural soil. So that's another key threat. Development is another one. So we are always we're constantly, Woodland Trust, dealing with threats to ancient woodland from planning applications. And this is kind of a cause rather than a threat, but them being quite small in size means they're more at risk from threats. So the bigger the buffer you can put around an ancient woodland through planting more trees, allowing trees to naturally regenerate, the better it's likely able to deal with some of those pressures. But it all sounds quite doom and gloom, but actually the solution for some of that is quite similar in some respects. It's about improving the health of that woodland so that it can deal with both the known threats and the unknown threats. Particularly, we need more appropriate management is one of the priorities.
I would second all of that. Fragmentation, edge effects, poor management, pests were certainly on my list, and development too. Another one I would add would be the level of enforcement of the protections to ancient woodlands, because there are some that even without the development, without developmental permissions, may have been damaged or removed without that being a developmentally permitted thing.
Dr. Kirby, do you have anything to add?
I would reinforce particularly the inappropriate management and lack of management, because that's affecting probably the largest area, both of ancient semi-natural woodlands and the plantations on ancient woodland sites, but also flag that increasingly we are seeing effects of climate change, more extreme storms, which will take out, for example, a lot of the really ancient trees in the countryside. Spring droughts leading to death and disease and more vulnerability to disease. And, well, we're not quite sure what the rainfall effects are, but we know that woods, if you get very wet soils, the trees are more vulnerable to being blown over. Mm-hmm. So a combination of wet autumns and then spring gales is probably a bad combination.
Great. Just a couple of follow-ups. Translocation, habitat translocation, what's the viability of that as a solution to the threats that you've just kind of outlined? Because I think there's a bit of scepticism out there about whether that is viable. What's your view on that, I guess?
It's not an answer. If, despite the planning guidance, an area of ancient woodland is to be destroyed, then you can try to rescue bits from the wreckage. And that is worth doing. It's better than not doing anything, but it shouldn't be part of the decision as to whether or not that woodland should be destroyed in the first place.
That's very clear. Just to Mr. Phillips, if it's okay, I'm just interested about the pause sites that we've been discussing, and just kind of what level does it have to get to for the Woodland Trust to be satisfied that it's restored? Because obviously restoration is the ambition, but it would just be useful for us to know what level of input needs to be there.
Yeah, it's in a way there's two parts. There's kind of a level for measurement for policy, which always has to be relatively simple, because if it's too complicated, it would be hard to measure at a national level, which is often based around native tree cover. But in terms of actually on site, we would say that doesn't go far enough. So actually, for a site, and also which is a slightly challenging one, but effectively it's about improving the ecological condition of the wood. So there's some really good tools out there. So Forestry Commission have also developed a tool called Woodland Ecological Condition Assessment, and effectively it allows you to show the health of your wood over time. And so we would like to see tools like that used to show that these sites are effectively getting to a point that they're healthy. But ultimately, in terms of when restoration is finished, if we were advising a landowner, we would say this is kind of an ongoing process, because with climate change, with changes with deer populations, it's always an ongoing job, so it's never kind of finished. But in terms of policy, that's often based around the native canopy cover. Just for simplicity terms, even though we would say for ecology terms, you need to be much deeper than that.
And just on other risks, right of access and right to roam and access to nature have all been kind of discussed. Would you see any of those in conflict with protecting these important habitats?
So I think it's, we're in a period where people are becoming increasingly disconnected from nature, and I know how I value nature for my mental health and personal benefit, and I think it would be a real shame if we got to a position of saying people can't access and enjoy ancient. A lot of these ancient woodlands are in quite urban areas sometimes, are in quite areas with a lot of poverty, and it is about responsible access though. I would say we manage a large estate, and a large part of our management of the estate is about dealing with sometimes with littering, it might be inappropriate use, vandalism. So there is two sides. So I think it's I would say it's absolutely needs to be supported. Access into woodlands and ancient woodlands is really critical, but it does just need to be managed, and sometimes that can cost money for organisations in terms of signage, having staff to monitor sites, check their fires aren't being lit and so forth. So it's incredibly important we don't put a fence around them. I think that would be a mistake.
You mentioned buffer zones. How big would a buffer zone have to be to protect from the kind of nitrogen pollution that you kind of mentioned? I just wanted a bit more of an understanding about how far that would have to be effective, because I can imagine a policy being written saying 20 metres or 3 miles. Like what kind of scale are we talking about, or is it very specific to the sites, I guess?
It is variable, and it depends on what level of impact you can detect. There have been studies which have detected impacts 100 metres, 50 metres into a woodland, but probably most of the impact a lot of the impact could be offset by 20 metres, 25 metres.
That's very helpful. Do you think that there's enough national guidance around these areas at the moment, or do you think that could be more robust in policies that we should be asking for as a committee?
I think it probably needs a bit more research. Sorry, I would say that.
You know anyone who could do this research? Not
me. But I think it would be good to have more research on, particularly if you have just grass, there's not a lot stopping the nitrogen coming in. If you can develop dense foliage in that may well mean you can use narrower buffers.
Can come back on that question a bit. I think in some respects, I totally hear what Keith's saying there, and I think I'd be pushed to probably take a precautionary principle in that, you know, we probably haven't got time in some cases for these ancient woodlands until we, and I think he's totally right, it does depend on the impact, but there have been some good discussions, I think, between Forestry Commission, Natural England Woodland Trust on almost like what buffers you would put in under the precautionary principle of it won't be perfect, but it will be better than what we've got now, so until we've got that evidence to replace that suggestion. So if I could take a kind of action almost, I'm happy to feed the evidence in with colleagues who are working on that into the committee on what the latest is on that, because they've had some good discussions and some recommendations on the buffer.
I think that would be very helpful. And just final question from me on animal management that you mentioned. Quite a controversial issue with deer, I'm sure, but is there a set of policies that would enable better animal management that you would like to see us recommending?
Deer hunting.
I think with deer management, one of the biggest challenges is really about getting landowners to cooperate and work together, because quite often we've got a woodland that's surrounded by, might be, in some cases woodlands are very small, it might be, 30 or 40 landowners in a relatively small area. And so I think the more government has just produced an updated deer policy statement, which we really welcomed. And I think what would be really helpful actually is to look at Scotland as the model. So Scotland have commissioned an evidence review on what legislative changes are needed to really get deer management going. Because I think some of the challenges with deer management is there's only so much you can do with kind of carrots and in terms of supporting people to work together. But I should be clear, incentives, just to clarify that one. That's but there is an argument for regulatory reform, change as well as needed, and so Scotland have made some quite radical changes here. So I think it would be good for the government in England to commission the same type of evidence review. We've got a good place in terms of the policy statement they've put out, but I do think it would be good to look at legislative sides as well.
Any other views on that?
Encourage people to eat more venison.
Okay, very good. Okay, thank you, Chair.
It's a recommendation we can all get behind. Right, I've got a few people wanting to come in with brief questions. So firstly, I'm going to go to Barry, then to Jonathan, then to Sammy.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Kirby, you spoke of wet soils and spring gales being probably a bad combination. And obviously we understand that there are edge effects on woodland. What difference does the size of the woodland make to its ability to withstand those wet soils and spring gales?
The smaller the wood, obviously, the bigger the edge area. Edge trees actually are often a bit more stable than those in the middle because they've been exposed to the winds before, which is why in the 87 you often got a halo of trees standing and the middle's blown out. So, but the other edge effect is you get a drying out of the areas and loss of humidity at the edges of the woods. And that can be particularly damaging for some of the more specialist lichens and bryophytes, mosses and liverworts in the west of the country, which are dependent on a very humid microclimate, not necessarily wet soils, but humid microclimate. So that is, the smaller woods will have a bigger edge area
and bigger propensity for damage.
Yep.
What therefore can be done or should be done to protect those smaller woodland areas? Is there a way of trying to insulate them against those wet soils and spring gales?
As I think Nick mentioned earlier, targeting some of the new woodland around small patches to increase their size would be a very good way of using some of the new planting.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Phillips, could I say wolves to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's certainly been discussed, in a Scotland context. I think there's a really important place for bringing back natural processes, basically the bits of the system that we have removed, and that's why we're having to do so much intervention into woodlands, and as well as expanding the level of trees around woodlands to buffer them, improving the condition of that small patch as well would be one of the best security kind of policies, because we don't know what change is going to happen. The weather's taking everybody by surprise. Some of the predictions we had are now changing. So I think one of the best things we can do for our ancient woodlands is about buffering them, increasing the patch size, thinking about connectivity between those areas, and improving the health of the patches that we've already got.
And comes back once
exactly.
again. And our colleagues in Europe, they've lived with wolves as top predators quite amicably for many years, have they not?
Yeah, and I think there's always there's various different species that are being considered. Like beaver's another one as well. That we've already got some good examples where effectively the woodland management we're talking about they're doing for us in some sites. I think it's. I would like, I guess, from a policy point of view, more focus maybe on the not so charismatic species as some of the species in woodlands that we know so little about. I mean, it's an area of science which we don't know we do enough, but the soil biodiversity, the more we're learning about that, totally underpinning the health of the woodland, totally underpinning the carbon in all habitats and across farmland and everything. But we know very little about it, and that really worries me. So that would be something I would like to see as a priority to get a handle on that.
Thank you. Jonathan Davis.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a site of ancient woodland in my constituency, Chaddeston Wood, and it's the only ancient woodland in the city of Derby, a 9-hectare site supporting a very rich cross-section of biodiversity, but the site is at risk from development, or it has been previously, and I didn't want to miss the opportunity to speak to some experts about that. I appreciate this isn't my question part of the meeting, but do you feel there's enough protection within the NPPF to make sure those buffer zones are retained? And if so, how do we articulate how that needs to be more robust to government, but also to local authorities as well, which are often between a rock and a hard place where it comes to housing development?
Want to go for the first one? I mean, I think I'd probably use 3 words to kind of describe the policy at the moment. It's about inconsistent, insufficient and disconnected, and to explain those. So inconsistent in that we've got a policy which says development that impacts ancient woodlands should be rejected unless there's wholly exceptional reasons it shouldn't be. But I think the interpretation of that at local authority level is radically different, and so that isn't helpful, because we're effectively seeing planning cases being approved when they shouldn't be because of differences in interpretation. Insufficient in terms of, despite what's supposed to be quite strong protection, we're still seeing quite a lot of decisions going the wrong way on ancient woodlands, and disconnected in terms of the way we protect ancient woodlands is quite in boxes. So we've got some protection over here from development, we've got a little bit of protection over here from inappropriate management in forestry, and nothing really in the middle. And so what would be great is if we had a more coherent policy and regulation structure which effectively brought that together. And I guess with development it's often quite viewed as kind of not damaging ancient woodland rather than incorporating it into development, and how development could actually benefit the ancient woodland. I think there could be some real scope for kind of nature positive development rather than a kind of purely it shouldn't be about the harm side as well.
Is there enough synergy then between the environmental improvement plan and the NPPF, or are they diametrically kind of opposed on this?
I think there's a lot of contradictions between those two. I think it would be a real opportunity to see nature as a really positive part of development rather than something that's kind of in the way, I guess. So I think there is a real opportunity. I mean, you can see communities how much they benefit from woodlands. I mean, the year of the heat wave, it wasn't a surprise where I saw most of my local community. They were all in areas that were cool, and actually that happened to be their local green spaces and their woodlands, which were significantly cooler. And so people really appreciate that. And I think if we're going to be establishing new developments and communities, we should be thinking about giving those the same access to those types of places as well. So I think, short answer, I don't think there is.
Thank you. Samuel Wilson.
Professor Kirby, I think it was you mentioned that the biggest threat to woodlands was either lack of management or over-management, and that really what they needed, if they were going to be preserved, was appropriate management. Could you actually give the committee some idea of what is meant by appropriate management of woodlands? And is the biggest impediment to that economics, because sometimes that kind of management doesn't produce much revenue?
Yeah. What appropriate is, in a sense, a site-specific thing. So it's looking at the wood, looking at what its features are, and then how they will be affected by different types of management. So it's not necessarily trying to have one system that will definitely fit all circumstances. It generally will mean less intensive, smaller scale working, and you're right, that will often be more expensive. And so we need to support systems that will recognise that. It may also mean, if we're using native species, native broadleaves, then we need to recognise that will probably mean lower production levels compared to, in terms of volume, to some extent in terms of biomass and carbon as well. Again, we need to work out, are there ways in which the owner can be recompensed for accepting that lower production, as it were. It also perhaps means that in some cases you might have what would be ideal biodiversity management, and accepting that, no, we can't, in a sense, afford that, and we need to go for a mix of some production, but maybe not as much as would give you the best returns. And in a lot of cases, these woods have survived because they were managed in the past. And that's why undermanagement now can be a problem, because a lot of the species were used to the woods being opened up periodically, and now they've not had any felling in them for 60 odd years. So we need to find the sort of sweet spot in the middle. It's getting the woods cared for, and I'd actually use that rather than protection in a lot of circumstances. And often the owners are the people who are best placed to do that and to know what it is that's important about it. Now, they usually do know their sites.
Thank you very much. John Whitby.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Kirby just mentioned carbon. The committee's heard conflicting evidence on the role of ancient woodland in carbon sequestration. Do ancient woodlands still continue to generate a net reduction in greenhouse gases over time?
Yes. Most of the crops actually on the ground, as it were, in ancient woodland, as Nick said earlier, are not necessarily that old. I mean, a lot of the woods were felled during the Second World War, and the woods I work in Whiteham, it almost entirely large areas felled. So most of the trees in there are no more than 80 years old.
Right, so a lot of that is due
and
to
that's fairly
growth,
typical
yeah.
of ancient woodlands across the country. So they're still in actually quite a rapidly growing state, right, and will continue for probably another 100 years or so if they were just left. Yeah. There are some caveats. That assumes that we're not harvesting, so then there's a trade-off with potential economic returns. There's a trade-off that in some of these woods we'd actually like them more opened up for biodiversity, and in that case then you're felling, you're reducing your carbon there. And the one that is uncertain is the impact of things like ash dieback. in Whiteham, ash is 25% of the canopy. It's the fastest growing, it has been the fastest growing tree, and it's now dying. So we're in the process of trying to work out exactly what that's going to mean for the carbon budget of that particular wood. It probably won't turn the wood into a carbon sink, a source rather, but it will certainly reduce the degree to which it is taking up carbon.
Do ancient trees actually stop sequestering carbon at any point, or do they always sequester something? As long as it's got a full canopy, it will be sequestering carbon at a very fast rate. As they start to retrench, then the net sequestration will start to decline.
Okay. I come back on that question
of course,
quickly, just because I think one of the really key things of ancient woodland is that they are, as Keith says, totally agree, still sequestering. But the biggest, in terms of just carbon, it's the carbon they're capturing. And actually, when you look at carbon, it's very focused just on trees, but 80% of the carbon's in the soil. So it's if we really want to look at the woodland ecosystem, we need to be looking at the whole wood, and that's a radically different picture. But I guess the other key point around ancient woodlands is carbon is almost like a co-benefit. It's a benefit we get. And it would be a mistake, I think, to try and maximise carbon for a couple of reasons. One, it would potentially damage or degrade the irreplaceable parts of the ancient woodland. And secondly, in doing that woodland management, you're improving the health of the wood. So even if you're having a small carbon impact, you're actually protecting the overall far bigger carbon store in the longer term. So I think in any scenario, they're incredibly important for carbon, but their true value is all of the other values added together, really, which is irreplaceable. That's the bit that we can't get back.
Yeah, well, on that point, I think it's fair to say that the newer growth is where the majority of the sequestration is from. But we've obviously heard the concerns about the impact of significant replanting on ancient woodland sites. So is there a tension, and is it possible to sort of to balance that tension?
So I think this could be really positive in many cases. So a lot of these plantation ancient woodland sites are not managed for anything at the moment. So they're not managed for nature or for timber production. But when you're doing the restoration, because you're doing that restoration quite slowly, often it goes into quite local wood markets. So we've got a situation in Devon where the restoration we're doing, which is the conifers coming off site, they're going into the timber market, which they would do in any case, even if it wasn't being restored. But because it's quite a slow restoration, it's able to support a lot more local businesses, because traditionally you just chop the whole lot down and there's no way small local wood businesses would be able to cope with all that wood at once. So there's a potential win-win-win here, really. It could be positive for nature, positive for local jobs, and if you have that timber locked up in long-lived products in construction or furniture, it could be good, positive for carbon as well. It does depend, is always the answer, really, on how it's managed and what happens. But I think I don't think there's a tension there. But I think in any case, they cover such a small area of the UK. Our focus really should be on the irreplaceable bits of protection.
And is there a difference between PAWS and ASNW in terms of carbon storage and sequestration?
It depends on which bits of it you're measuring.
Yeah.
Some of the trees in the ancient semi-natural woodland, if you're harvesting them and then it goes for firewood, then that is obviously not a long-term store in that sense. But as long as they're still growing fast, then they will be sequestering them.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Ms. Flach, can I just come back to you? You said earlier about some of the ancient woodlands that have been lost out with of planning applications, and talked about enforcement. I mean, from your experience, when they're lost, is this due to a lack of expertise on local authorities? If it's not local authorities, who should be enforcing the protection of these ancient woodlands or ancient trees that are lost. Or if it's not a lack of expertise, a lack of resource, can you just give us a sense as to when these ancient woodlands or parts of ancient woodlands are lost, what the cause is in terms of enforcement?
The example I was thinking of at the time was when updating the inventory, and it was a surprise to Natural England that a particular area of ancient woodland had been cleared, or mostly cleared, for a golf course. We obviously passed that on to Natural England, and perhaps that had been allowed. I didn't look into the local authority planning applications, but there should be a joined up approach whereby the people that know the most about ancient woodlands and the irreplaceability of the habitat are involved in the decisions and the developmental decisions, so that the correct decisions can be made, so that they aren't lost without true understanding of the habitat.
And Mr. Phillips, you were talking about the inconsistency of the way that planning policy is implemented across different local authorities. I mean, again, do you think that is down to an inconsistency in terms of the knowledge on those local authorities, or are there other causes? Is there a sort of deliberate policy of being more generous or less generous in different areas?
I think it's probably a mix of things. I think there's kind of policy changes that could help, but I think in particular, I think it's sometimes that the expertise and access to expertise in local authorities is so important to support that, and I think having common, clear guidance. So where there are interpretations or options for interpretation in planning policy, I think that's where you will get different interpretations. So I think that's something we would like to see is support for local authorities. You know, often they don't have huge amounts of capacity, and often quite high workloads. So I think access to expertise and also reviewing the national planning policy framework in itself in terms of how wholly exceptional is interpreted, because that should be the only cases where ancient woodland cases are approved.
Okay, we want to come to the end of this first panel session, but let's bring Barry Gardner in for a final question.
Dr. Kirby, Mr. Phillips was talking about the importance of soil for sequestration, but one of the things that we haven't touched on here, and I wanted to ask you about it, and that is, do ancient woodlands have distinctive mycorrhizal networks, and how important are they for the strength and the survival of those woodlands?
Insofar as we know, they do have distinct fungal communities, and those are almost certainly key to some of the relationships within the woodland. I mean, it's an area that's rapidly expanding with the ability to identify species through environmental DNA. So they are critical, and it's probably one of the reasons why new woodland takes a long time to acquire some of the distinctive characteristics, is that the soils are impoverished in terms of the fungal communities, and they're a different type of fungal community, and that it will take time before those build up.
More research is required there too, is it?
Undoubtedly, but it's going on.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and finally, if I come as Flach, can you just talk through the role of local environmental record centres in providing that expertise about what is actually there?
Yes, so developers are encouraged by local authorities to contact environmental record centres for the most up-to-date and accurate data on habitats as well as species and protected sites, so that while the ancient woodland inventory is freely available, the other protected sites and other protected habitats are accessed through local environmental record centres, and I I'm not sure that I remember the rest of the question.
Well, just basically explaining the role of them in keeping those records and how they're utilised within the process.
Yes, so it's obviously a large amount of data, and their management. I think it's important to have specific and non-biased scientific and data professionals working on managing and making sure that accurate data is available for everyone.
And developers are kind of encouraged to utilise these facilities, but if they don't, is there a danger that that information isn't considered when it should be?
Yes, there are some available national data sets that are similar but generally less locally accurate, and that's the benefit of environmental record centres. They have the local knowledge and the local expertise.
Brilliant. Well, thank you to all three of you for that excellent session, and we'll bring this panel to a close. But we'll change places for the second panel, but this sitting is suspended. Order. To order. Well, welcome back everyone to the second of the panel sessions today, looking into ancient woodlands. We have a distinguished panel within the forestry sector for this second panel. I would just encourage us, the three panellists, to just introduce themselves, their organisation and who their organisation represents. So starting with you, if I may, Mr. Knight.
Steve Knight. So I'm an independent forestry and ecology consultant representing Confor at this point in time, who is has several members across the country, all across the industry, represents the forestry sector.
And just to be clear, your members are primarily harvesting of timber and within the wood industry?
Not necessarily, but it is a large part of that, yeah, but not necessarily. There's some small woodland owners as part of that as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Tubby.
Good afternoon, I'm Ian Tubby. I head up the Policy and Advice team at the Forestry Commission. Forestry Commission is a non-departmental government body. We're underpinned by the Forestry Act, and we are in a position where we balance woodland creation and maintaining adequate reserves of standing trees and timber with conservation of flora, fauna and the landscape. There's three bits to our organisation. Forestry England does the exciting stuff and they look after the nation's forests. They've got about 220,000 hectares of forests, including 43,000 hectares of plantations and ancient woodland sites. Forest Research provide us with the evidence base on which we make policy and delivery decisions, and then Forest Services, the bit that I'm in, does the regulation and incentivises woodland creation and management in England.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Mr. Weatherall.
Yes, thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm representing the Institute of Chartered Foresters. That's a professional body for forestry and woodland conservation, so it's a cross-sectoral body. I sit on their environmental special interest group. My day job is with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, and in both organisations I am interested in ancient woodland protection and management as well.
And on that, starting with you, Mr. Weatherall, I mean, how can ancient woodlands be managed to best preserve and enhance their environmental benefits from your perspective?
Well, I think the key challenge has already been talked about in the first session, which is resilience. I think the key thing for management is improvement in condition. We talked about already that only 9% of our woodlands are in good condition. That will include things like re-wetting environments in some cases, increasing the number of rarer tree species, so that there's a greater diversity there, and things like deer and grey squirrel management as well.
Yeah. What about you, Mr. Tubby? Is there anything else you would add in terms of how we best manage ancient woodlands?
I think there's an economic element to this as well, for owners to be motivated, or for many owners to be motivated to manage their woodland. They need an economic incentive to do so. So when it comes to hardwood, markets for hardwood are very, very limited. There's only about 100,000 tonnes or so, a million tonnes or so harvested in England, and nearly all of that goes to firewood and biomass markets. So those markets are underpinning the management of broadleaf woodland in England. And it would be great to see additional markets opened up for that, and that's something that we're trying to do. If there isn't opportunity with timber markets, then I think in the previous session somebody alluded to finding other ways of making it economically desirable to manage woodlands. So that could be CSR type investments from corporate sector, carbon, water quality, biodiversity units, but some economic return to owners, I think, will help encourage the responsible management of woodlands longer term.
And I mean, it brings us nicely on to you, Mr. Knight. I mean, from the perspective of your members. Can you just lay out for us their efforts that they're making to protect ancient woodlands, and also how that sort of economic benefit model works alongside that need for preservation of ancient woodland?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, the ancient woodland, we say, it's a generic kind of term, but we've already understood that it's a mixture of broadleaf and conifer. So each of those will be managed in a different way. And part of the process of the protection is the planning of those. So most large woodlands will have a management plan, which would have indicated that things are ancient woodland. So they would have been protected and managed, or if it's a poor site, then they would have been assessed, and then a management plan would have been drawn up for long-term restoration. If they're smaller woodlands, perhaps they would have been gone through the felling licence process, and again that would have been picked up through that process as a regulatory. So in terms of protection, it's the legal framework is there already for protection. I think in terms of additional to that, most large forestry owners might be signed up certification schemes as well, or QOS certification, which would have also highlighted those aspects of protection and restoration on poor sites. The economics of those, however, are very much different in terms of broadleaf to conifer. And I think unfortunately across the country you can see that a lot of the low economical return broadleaves are not perhaps being worked as much as they should be in order to encourage the resilience of those forests and those woodlands, those ancient woodlands.
You say not being worked enough. What do you mean by that?
Quite a lot of the small ancient woodlands are difficult to work because they're on accessibility, the cost of working them. The economics basically fail it to work. So,
sorry, I'm not being absolutely clear on what you mean by working. Do you mean felling, or do you mean management? Can you just expand?
Let's say management. So woodland. So yes, in order to manage a woodland for encouragement of that woodland to regenerate and to become resilient, typically you have to fell some trees in order to.
If we're talking about felling trees, just say that. That's fine. Yeah.
Fine. Okay. Yeah.
So by working, you mean we're not felling enough of those trees because of the economics of it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think largely economics do come into that, and the markets drive those economics. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Alison Griffiths.
Thank you, Chair. This question I'm going to focus on Mr. Tubby and Mr. Weatherall, because I think you will have answered some of this already, but feel free at the end to come in on it too. So for plantations on ancient woodland sites, what stops us going beyond management and restoring them to something more like ancient and semi-natural woodland? And for the poor sites, is the lower biodiversity that we see there a reason for restoration of these sites?
So in terms of barriers to restoration and taking the conifer off and replacing it with native species, a lot of it is economics. And we have some evidence that the asset value of a restored woodland is lower than the asset value of a woodland stocked with conifer. So if you're a private woodland owner and you're depending on the return from your land, that's going to be a factor. And in addition to the capital value, there's also the revenue from timber sales. So conifer, the conifer market or softwood market functions very well. So there's strong demand for softwood, and a rotation length of a conifer crop, if you're clear felling, maybe around 40 years. If you're moving to a continuous cover system, then you have little and often returns, and you can go and harvest regularly. If you clear the conifer and re-establish native broadleaves, they grow slower, so their rotation length might be 100 years before you get a return on that investment. In some parts of the country, grey squirrels make it very, very difficult to grow good quality broadleaf trees so that the owner can then sell them to sawmills to make longer-lived products, hence why the firewood market is so important. So an awful lot of this is dependent on economics. And those smaller fragments of woodland we heard about in the previous session, 3.5 hectares and smaller, it's very, very difficult to make those woodlands pay unless you start working with your neighbours. So I would say economics is one of the biggest barriers to this.
Thank you. And Mr. Weatherall?
Yeah, I do agree with my colleagues about the economic factors. I think it would be astonishing if we expected, private landowners and businesses to make choices that were had adverse financial impacts for them. So this is about market failure to deliver non-market value, biodiversity, carbon, other benefits. So I would actually look at the government and at private finance initiatives as the way to overcome this. We are in a nature and climate emergency. The government does have biodiversity targets, some of which are through the Environment Improvement Plan. So the mechanisms should not fall onto the private sector, but to be supported in some way to achieve the ambitions that we have, ambitions for the restoration and improvement in condition of ancient woodlands. So economics underlies it, but the solutions do not lie solely with the private sector.
Thank you. And so to that point, specifically, so before I move on, Mr. Knight, was there anything you wanted to add to the previous answers and to your own previous answer?
Yeah, can I just add that it's easy to lump conifer pores as being just conifer and the dense and the destroying the ancient woodlands. But in terms of the scale of different types of habitat you get on pore sites, you can have some sites where you've got wide open space, conifer, timber conifer, such as Douglas or larch, with a functioning ecosystem of broadleaf within that and underneath. So the extremes of what we call in terms of pores would be different in terms of value to the biodiversity and how much you would restore and how much you would need to restore. So it is possible to have a balance in some circumstances where you can do both timber production through conifer and biodiversity restoration. And sometimes the conifer broadleaf mix that is being worked, so it's been tree felled and commercial, allows that to happen, might be in better ecological condition than neglected pure broadleaf woodlands that are just not being felled or managed.
That is very helpful nuance. Thank you. And this question specifically from Mr. Tubby, do you think that the scope and delivery of the Forestry Commission's targets for restoration of ancient woodlands are driving the right outcomes?
Yes, but slower than we'd hoped. So Forestry England have committed to restoring all of their pores restoration, and they've started work on that. And as we heard in the previous session, it could take decades for full restoration to be achieved. In the private sector, we've got perhaps the primary challenge of engaging all of those owners of woodland who aren't currently managing their woodlands at all. And a proportion of those will own ancient woodlands that they're not managing. So one of our first jobs is to try and increase the proportion of woodland under management in general in England. And then we need to go further on the restoration of ancient woodlands and target those woodlands where we can. And grants are available to help woodland owners do that. And we're seeing beginning to see some uptake. We've got, I think, 2,100 hectares of pores restoration grant has been taken up over the last 2 or 3 years, and we expect that to grow. But it does ultimately come back to this economic point and understanding why ancient woodland was cleared and plantations established in the first place, whether the plantations were oak or beech or spruce or pine. And that is because those old woodlands were not as economically productive as they might have been. and government policy was to increase production and increase productivity, and the private sector responded to that. So we've now got to try and address that without penalising owners who perhaps acted in good faith decades ago and did their job and increased timber supply and availability. And now we've got to encourage them to restore. But as my colleague said, there's degrees of restoration. And what do we mean by restoration? We've lost elm in the landscape. We're losing ash. They were really important components of those ancient woodlands.
Can I just ask, what would you prioritise? You mentioned speed at the very beginning of your answer, which I thought was perceptive. What would you be prioritising to shift the dial on that speed of change?
In terms of overall benefits to biodiversity and woodland resilience, I would first really like to see us increase the overall area or proportion of woodland that is in active management. And if all of the owners were able to thin their woodlands just a little bit more, so harvest more trees and shoot a few more deer, that would really, really benefit our biodiversity and the structure of the woodland and its ability to naturally regenerate. So that would be my fix-all. And then I would like to further promote the grants that are currently available to owners of plantations on ancient woodland sites.
Thank you very much. I mean, on that question of deer, we heard in the previous panel the extent to which deer are one of the real causes of damage. I mean, what is the landscape for a woodland owner currently, and what do you think should be being requested in terms of that deer management and shooting deer effectively?
I think over the last 2 or 3 years we've seen beginning to see a real change in the overall approach to deer management at landscape scale. So we've got 2 native species of deer and 4 introduced species of deer. And each represents their own kind of challenges, and they do different types of damage. But to deal with large herding species such as fallow, we really need to encourage landscape scale control. So that's collaboration between owners. And Natural England are involved in a really successful pilot in Sussex that's bringing, I think, nearly 40 owners together to try and control deer across that landscape. If you end up with just 1 or 2 owners culling deer on their land, then obviously you're not really having a big impact on the population overall. And the recently published government deer management policy statement set out some changes to licensing arrangements. We've been looking at what's happening in Scotland, and again my colleagues at Natural England have made it easier to obtain a licence for shooting deer at night. And that, combined with changes in technology such as night vision and thermal sights, should help us increase the humane culling of more deer. In combination, we're also trying to increase demand for venison. So Keith said we need to be eating more venison. We absolutely do. It's a free-range, healthy meat. So, and we also need, frankly, a disposal route for those stalkers who shoot the deer. They need to be able to move that carcass on, and we should be making use of that carcass. So we're promoting the British Quality Wild Venison Standard and working with accredited game handling establishments and other organisations to try and make better use of this natural product and reducing the environmental and economic damage it's causing to woodlands and agriculture.
Sorry, did I see you wanted to also contribute as well?
Yeah, I wanted to come in because I can see Guy's Hospital out the window over the Thames, and they're serving wild venison there to patients, doctors and visitors, which I think is a fantastic initiative that we need to see more of, and will really, prime that. If we've got the demand, the supply becomes more economical. I think it would hit the government's growth agenda as well. Yeah. I would encourage the committee to take a field trip and go across and eat some wild venison and speak to some doctors and patients.
In favour.
Well, we give a lot of thought to the food we put in front of this committee, and we'll put venison on the menu. Okay, thank you. It is Julia Buckley, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. You've already touched on deer management, and you've made a really articulate case about the economic threat to our woodlands. But can we now talk about whether you agree with the previous panel's assessments? We were glad to see you observing that panel. Their assessments of the threats facing ancient woodlands and how they can be addressed. And could I start with yourself, Dr. Weatherall?
Yes, I agree. I think they comprehensively talked about the threats in terms of climate change, drought, flooding, wildfire as well would be on the list, and the associated rise in pests and diseases as well as deer, grey squirrels, and of course the development threats as well. I think where I would perhaps differ from some of the comments made would be in terms of the buffering, because I would see the buffering as an opportunity for natural colonisation from the seed source. We can't create new ancient woodlands, but the next best thing is an expansion around them from natural processes, and evidence suggests that within 100 metres of those ancient woodlands, within 20 years you can get about 100 stems per hectare across a range of habitat types. So I would push strongly for the buffer zone to be 100 metres, and for, if land use change is going to happen in those areas, the default should be towards woodland expansion through natural colonisation, which can actually contribute to the tree cover expansion targets that the government are trying to achieve.
Really helpful, thank you. And yourself, Mr. Tubby?
Yes, I'd love to see all of those fragments of ancient woodland, so all of those 3.5 hectare spots around the countryside expanded to 10 hectares. That would really benefit the core ancient woodland in the middle, help meet government woodland creation targets, and hopefully also start to join some of those fragments up into larger and more robust and resilient woodlands. So that would be my starting point.
Are you suggesting that if the woodlands are more of a critical mass, a larger size, additional benefits accrue from that?
Yes.
Okay. And yourself, Mr. Knight?
I mean, obviously, I think for my mind, deer is the largest threat at the moment in terms of condition. Squirrels, grey squirrels also, because you can plant the trees, or the trees might regenerate, come to 15 years, and then the squirrels destroy them. So, those two go together really. And I think also species diversity within the woodlands themselves, in terms of tree and vegetative diversity, is important. And I think having monocultural broadleafy type woodlands is going to be an issue, as much as it is with conifer, particularly as climate change, pests and diseases are becoming more problematic. We might have to consider having a large range of broadleaf that are non-native to buffer some of these woodlands in order to allow that critical mass that we are talking about.
So are you suggesting the definitions, again, should be made wider in order to make this more feasible?
Not necessarily definitions, but be a bit more mindful that there may be cases where it might be acceptable to have some non-natives to help buffer the natives. But
a mixed.
Yeah, a mix. I mean, you certainly need, in terms of resilience for any type of woodland, having species diversity is always key.
So between you, you've suggested what feels like targets or minimum thresholds, which feels like a proposal that could be fed into government in our report. But you also were very clear at the start that this is an economic issue of businesses. So how do we persuade businesses by adding more regulation? How do we crack this nut?
I don't think adding more regulation is the way forward. I think because of the economics, if truly a woodland is not economic to work, and if you want that to progress forward, then there needs to be some sort of funding stream there. The issue we currently have in the private sector with the funding streams that have been available is that they're usually all tied up with other things that you have to do as well. There may be scope for having something like a small grant scheme where you're targeting, like in Wales do, where you target just actual targets to deal with the ancient woodland restoration, so you don't have to do all these other add-ons for it, perhaps.
So separate specific grant schemes replicating successful ones in Wales. Did you want to come in, Dr. Weatherall?
Yes, thank you. I think we should try and keep an eye on the big picture and the scale of ancient woodlands here. So they only cover about 2.5% of the land. They're probably about a quarter of the total closed canopy woodland cover that we've got. In terms of government objectives, a key objective at the moment is 30 by 30, but where by DEFRA's own assessment, we're less than 6% of the way towards that, with 4 and a bit years to go. That 2.5% ancient woodlands, only 16% of them are in triple SI status, the highest level of protection that we've got. I think we should be having a sort of paradigm shift in terms of how protected they need to be and the biodiversity targets that we're aiming for with them. So I think it's about government support, really looking at that private finance initiative and trying to get what are the best terrestrial habitats for biodiversity that we have into better forms of protection. And if that is not something that the market can deliver, that, as I've said, we've got to look at different ways of achieving it. But we're running out of time on this stuff.
It's as much about protecting what we already have with those financial subsidies as it is about growing and expanding the additional.
Well, I think we need both. We definitely, I do support the need for more timber within England. So new woodland creation should include an element of that. But ancient woodlands are the best we have. We don't have primary forest in this country. We did our deforestation long before it became fashionable, unfortunately. So I think we've really got to think about that protection, and there are government targets around this, as I say.
It's just about the funding following the action plan to match the policy.
Yeah.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Chris Hinchcliffe.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are relating primarily to planning policy protection. So I'm going to focus with you, Dr. Weatherall, but if others on the panel want to come in, please feel free to. My starting point is we recently had a debate in Westminster Hall about the value of our woodlands, and many people there spoke about how great our ancient woodlands are. There was a lot of lip service, if you like, to that. But we've heard in written evidence from the Woodland Trust that currently over 1,000 ancient woodlands are under threat from development across the UK. So I was wondering, from your perspective, whether you feel that our planning policy protections for these ancient woodlands are adequate.
I think on paper they are adequate, and I think in the previous session there was discussion about how they're interpreted. Ancient woodlands are categorised as irreplaceable habitats, so that they should only be affected if there are wholly exceptional circumstances, but it's very difficult to determine the interpretation of that across the country. I think it should be really big projects that is about. I'm going to be controversial and touch on the infamous Bat Tunnel that cost £100 million. The reason for the Bat Tunnel is that it is right next door to Sheephouse Wood, which is an ancient triple SI woodland. If some buffering had taken place so that the line went slightly further out, say another 100 metres, as I've suggested, the Bat Tunnel would not have been necessary. So having protections that are serious about our most precious habitats can help with some of this stuff.
Very good. And DEFRA recently published a review of the implementation of those planning protections afforded to ancient woodland in the MPPF, and found that almost half of applications were approved without a proper assessment of possible loss or deterioration, and without mitigation measures in place to avoid negative impacts to the ancient woodland and ancient veteran trees. We often hear in Parliament about the balance between growth and protections for nature, and often it's said the two can go hand in hand. But when you look at, I appreciate this is a veteran tree rather than ancient woodland, but if you look at the fate of the Covington pear, for example, voted as Tree of the Year and then promptly cut down to make way for HS2, do you feel that we are really just, saying the right things, but then when it comes down to it, development ultimately wins through, and what's on paper, it just stays on paper, and the reality is that the development always takes priority?
Yes, but I'm hopeful that things like the public outcry about tree losses, recently, will help to refocus. So as I say, on paper, it's about the follow-through. It's rhetoric to reality, isn't it? And some of that is perhaps a training element across the country to make sure that people do really understand how to protect and value those ancient trees and ancient woodlands. So I'm cautiously optimistic.
Cautiously optimistic. Well, that's very good to hear. This is obviously in the context of planning policy that's had quite significant upheaval. Some might say deregulation. Do you have any concerns that the changes in planning policy are going to put more ancient woodland at risk?
I'm not a planning expert, so I'm going to say I would hope not. I'm not close enough to that to answer. Maybe one of my colleagues would have a feeling on that.
Would anyone else on the panel like to comment on the changes in planning policy and whether that's going to put any additional ancient woodland at risk?
I don't know enough about it, but what I will say is that I understand that, the size of which you now will not need to have an assessment on it is quite small. Right. I'm not sure what impact that will have on the larger scale in terms of ancient woodland sites.
And I think although the National Planning Policy Framework sets out a reasonable level of protection for ancient woodland, describing it as irreplaceable habitat, perhaps we would like one improvement that we would perhaps like to see considered is increasing the buffers between woodland and new developments. So I think that's at the moment it's 15 metres or so. Yeah. Which is a pretty narrow strip. And I think there's need to differentiate as well between the kind of direct losses associated with development, which is relatively small for ancient woodland, but also the indirect additional pressure that new developments could put onto ancient woodlands. So people tipping their grass cuttings over the hedge, more access, whether legal or illegal, into the neighbouring woodland, the impact of pets on and trampling on the woodland soil, ground nesting birds and so on. So all of these factors, although slightly indirect, do have or can have an impact on ancient woodland and other woodland habitats. So increasing the buffer size, we wouldn't be adverse to having a look at that.
Okay, great, thank you. And coming straight back to you, Mr. Tubby, I think for many people in this country, the sort of iconic image in our mind of the ancient woodland may well be Wistman's Wood, obviously one of our temperate rainforests and fragments that we have remaining of that particular type of ancient woodland. Would you agree with the campaigners who have been calling for specific protections for temperate rainforests? Because we've already heard about the low proportion of ancient woodland in SSSI protection. The same is especially true of our temperate rainforests and the fragments we have of them. What's your perspective on that?
I don't know too much about that specific campaign, and I think we need to consider adding additional layers of protection on woodlands very, very carefully. I've certainly had experience of talking to woodland owners where they say, well, our woodland, we manage this woodland over here and it looks great, but they're concerned about doing the wrong thing on the SSSI designated part of the woodland. So additional protection needs to be thought through really, really carefully, and if additional protection is added, then I think we'll need to help people actually manage their woodlands and ensure that they thrive long term. And I think we also need to be careful of how the word protection is used when it comes to climate change adaptation. We're so reliant on a tiny handful of species. Research is suggesting that even established woodlands now are reducing the ability to naturally regenerate because of climate change and deer. So we need to be really careful about adding additional protection, and perhaps we should actually think about making it easier for owners to manage their woodland more appropriately.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much. Barry Gardner.
Very good. Thank you, Chair. Where to start? Mr. Weatherall, maybe if I can start with you, because you talked about the importance, perhaps, of financial incentive. I think it's been very clear from the panel that we have an asset value, and we have, if you like, a natural capital value. And when you suggested that there might be small grants available to incentivize private landowners to move more towards the natural capital value, would you like to see that as one of the recommendations that this committee might make?
Yes, I would, and I do appreciate that my colleague has said that grants are available and there is some take up. But I believe the current budget is £1 billion for tree cover expansion, and we would like to see, or for forestry, but we would like to see some proportion of that focused on existing woodland management, especially for ancient woodland restoration.
Great. Well, that's really helpful. Thank you. Look, we understand that a large amount of timber plantations on ancient woodlands are due to be harvested over the next 5 years. Perhaps, Mr. Tubby, you can tell us how you expect those sites to be harvested and replanted, and the environmental impact that you think that's going to have.
Certainly. Yes, I couldn't tell you with any confidence exactly how much woodland will be harvested in the next few years.
But you're the Forestry Commission guy here, aren't you?
I work in the Forestry Commission. But
under the Forestry Commission framework document, Article 8 says that you have the power to set out that data for production and supply of timber. So I assume that the Forestry Commission has the data, whether you have it yourself here or not.
We absolutely publish softwood availability forecasts and hardwood availability forecasts. What we don't know is exactly when a private landowner will choose to fell their woodlands, and we do not have the authority to direct a landowner to fell their trees.
Well, you do actually. You have that power under Section 12 of Annex 1 of the Forestry Commission framework document, which gives you the power to specify relevant projects and to veto what landowners are doing. But you very rarely do that.
We're not enacting those at the moment. I think the only directions to fell that we provide at the moment statutory plant health notices, and we issue those to try and stop the spread of disease. So if private owners do wish to fell their trees, they have to apply for a felling licence, and we want to know exactly how they're going to restock those woodlands. At the moment, an owner is perfectly entitled to fell conifer on a plantation on ancient woodland site and restock with conifer. They can do that.
They can, but you also have the power to stop them. That was my point.
We could, I think, perhaps, not grant a felling licence.
Yeah. Or you could actually designate the project, or you could veto the project unless it incorporated building back with broadleaf and so on.
I think that would be quite detrimental to the message we're trying to get out about more people trying to manage woodlands. But if trees are being felled, the choice is clear fell or moving towards continuous cover forestry. And certainly with plantation on ancient woodland site, we would encourage people to slowly restore that woodland over a period of time and not go in and clear fell and restock if that's possible.
Tell me how you go about incentivising them to do that until we get Mr. Weatherall's small grant schemes more focused on the development of ancient woodland. And perhaps, Mr. Knight, if you can come in from what I would call the commercial timber perspective, because we all recognise that commercial timber of softwood forestry is really important as well.
Okay, so the basics. To fell trees, you need a licence. So owners need to do that, whatever. We encourage owners to produce a woodland management plan that sets out long-term objectives, and we provide grant to do that. We also provide grants for deer control, squirrel control, and woodland improvement. And we also provide a grant for restoration of plantation on ancient woodland sites, and that's worth £275 a hectare a year. So the grants are there, and we really hope people make use of them because we want to see more plantations on ancient woodlands restored. So that's the offer at the moment.
Yeah.
And
just to get a commercial eye on that, is that offer sufficient, Mr. Knight, in your view, to incentivise most private woodland owners not to plant or to restock with Sitka spruce and other softwoods?
I mean, it's important to understand that there's many different owners,
of course,
and each of those will have their own objectives. In terms of
financial considerations,
considerations are a large driver of that. I mean, we are talking, potentially tens of millions of cubic meters worth of conifer on these sites if they are to be removed. The grants go so far, but they do not. They stop at a point because you're replacing a very commercial, fast rotation income with a much, perhaps, long-term, will it give you what you require at the end of a big risk of a much larger rotation? So there's a lot of risk. So in terms of, financial incentives, it's not really enough to do this large scale, in my opinion.
Okay. I'm just trying to focus on those ancient woodlands that have softwood plantation on them that are likely to be felled in the next 5 years. Can you give us an idea of the scale? What are we talking about roughly in hectares that are up for grabs in the next 5 years? Just from there.
I don't have those figures with me.
Is that something, Mr. Tubby, that the Forestry Commission might have?
Well,
or Natural England?
We know there's 42,000 hectares of conifer on ancient woodland sites at the moment. Per year, I think it would only be a few hundred hectares would be felled.
Our information was that a large amount of the timber plantations on ancient woodland would be felled.
Yeah,
are due to be harvested because they're coming to maturity.
It's down to the private owner to decide.
Of course it is, but yeah. a private owner who is managing that crop is going to want to take it when it's mature and receive the benefits of their years of nurturing it.
Yes. We don't have, I couldn't tell you today exactly how many of those hectares of conifer on pause have got a felling licence on them already or are in management already. The larger estates will have management plans and they will know when they're going to fell the trees. But these, we heard from Nick, 50% of the ancient woodlands are 3.5 hectares or smaller. And I would imagine that an awful lot of those are not managed. So only perhaps a tiny proportion of those woodlands will be thinned or felled.
And it's also, to add to that, Ian, is that some of those figures you're seeing in terms of plantations were not necessarily all going to be at maturity. Some of those might have been felled already and are now being in the second rotation. So that will be another 40 plus years before they come to fruition. So just to look at those figures as a whole, it's very difficult to say that there's that much land available and that those crops are all going to be felled.
My understanding is that the information that we were sent from the Woodland Trust suggested that, there we go, you see, I've started, so I'll finish. The Woodland Trust estimates that over 1,000 ancient woods are under direct threat from development across the UK, and the government planning agenda now looks to worsen that existing planning objections. The evidence argued that over 1,000 ancient woodlands are under threat from development, a number of which will increase dramatically. Stronger legal protections. But it's not actually giving me the figures there, actually. I wanted something that was trying to give me the figures from that. What are the barriers to using methods like continuous cover forestry for timber plantations to protect those ancient woodlands? Is it simply the commercial viability? Or are there other reasons?
I mean, there's a lot of other reasons, yeah. I mean, each site has its own unique kind of features which will make it difficult to transfer it over or transform it over to continuous cover type forestry.
They do this around the world elsewhere successfully. So my question to you is I suppose, why is it that we in this country find it so difficult when in other countries they don't?
I think the economic model in this country drives a lot of those answers as to why we don't do it.
Well, please explain. What have we got wrong with our economic model, if I can put it that way, that means in other countries it makes economic sense to do this, but it doesn't over here?
I think it's a case of the time scale of the income generation. Clear fell is much shorter, so your return is quicker. Although you do have to have more cost up front, you can generate a big lump of income over a shorter period of time. And continuous cover tends to be more difficult to manage on some sites, so the cost of managing continuous cover sometimes can be...
No, you're giving me what I've asked for the other way around, in effect. What I'm saying is, what makes it... What is giving us a problem? Mr. Tubby, you wanted to come in, yeah.
I think if you look at a lot of European countries, they have far more forest cover than us. If you look at England, half of the woodlands in the environment are less than 100 years old. So you've got a starting point where you've got an even age forest resource, or an awful lot of our forest resource is even age, including a large proportion of plantations on ancient woodland sites. So you're starting with a very simplified structure, and looking at it in pure economic terms, it's much easier to go in and fell that beautifully uniform product and put it to a sawmill and then restock. So if you already have a large area of existing cover and it's subject to natural disturbance, and you've got different age classes coming through, it's so much easier to manage on a continuous cover basis. And I would say we do continuous cover forestry quite well on an awful lot of our managed broadleaf estate forests and woodlands around the country. And we're beginning to see places like Stowhead and other estates moving towards continuous cover in Confor. But it takes time to develop that structural complexity, and it also takes perhaps a slightly different skill set than exists has existed historically in the forestry sector. And we're beginning to see that move back towards silviculture rather than forestry by numbers and plant on year X, take thinning every 10 years and then clear.
That's really helpful, thank you, because the clarity of understanding that the different ages are going to make it more attractive here to do it, because there aren't different ages, but it makes more sense in areas where there's larger forests of different tree age. Mr. Weatherall, you wanted to come in on?
Yeah, it was really on the last point made about there is a skills gap in forestry across the sector for commercial forestry and for woodland ecology and management. And so people have grown up or developed in their careers with a system and are now being asked to do something that is quite complex. It's quite difficult to transform from the even-aged kind of forestry approach to a continuous cover forestry approach. When we get there, it will be easier to then maintain it, but you need skilled workers who can deliver that kind of silviculture.
Very brief. I think we're coming back to you, aren't we, before the end? Yes, is that okay? Samuel Wilson.
You've explained that why it's difficult to have the continuous forest cover approach to harvesting trees. And it seems that the preference, or in fact just because of the way in which our trees are distributed at present, that the preference is for clearance, total clearance. We heard on an earlier submission, you probably heard it earlier on, that one of the ways in which the environmental damage is done is not so much just in the felling of the trees, but in how the trees are felled, and of course the most of the damage is done to the soil. Is there not the approach which is being taken where you do large clearances? Is that not a recipe for ensuring that you do the most environmental damage to the soil as well? Because you tend to be able, when you're doing total clearances, to use heavy machinery, for example. I've seen them clearing forests in my own constituency. It is amazing, but
I mean, it's fair to say there's a concern across the sector about reducing the environmental impact of either clear felling or thinning in ancient woodlands. And I have a gift actually for the committee. This is a book that was written by a chartered forester, one of my colleagues, Luke Barley, who works actually for the National Trust. It just came out last week. It's called Ancient, Reviving the Woods That Made Britain, so I'll pass it over to you.
It's worth under £300, isn't it?
Yes, yes, I'm afraid so. Luke would prefer it cost more, I think. But this talks in here about many of the topics we're discussing, but it talks about horse logging, for example, as a lower impact on the soil system of extracting timber in ancient woodland sites. You can use machinery that has lower impact on the compaction of the soil as well. So it is an active area right across the industry. Whilst it's true that clear felling will, have more environmental damage, that's not what we're looking for in ancient woodlands, because we want the gradual transformation of the canopy in terms of restoration. We're not looking for quick responses unless it's to remove trees quickly because of pests or diseases. So, yeah, there are methods that can be used in both clear felling and thinning, and we're trying to use them.
Can I add something to that, please? In a clear fell situation, you can use larger machines that have larger tyres, and there's more brash placed on the soil to protect it. So in fact you can have minimal soil impact if it's managed correctly. If you're working thin-ins all the time, so you're going in regularly, you're restricted to where you can go, and then you have limited amount of buffering from the soil, so you can actually have quite a large impact on the soil damage from continuously thinning. Some of the biggest challenges of ancient woodland management with the soil protection is that because of other constraints in terms of the species and some of the traditions that you see and the protections on Traveller size, and broadleaf particularly, you tend to be forced to work it in the winter months, which tend to be the wetter months. So regardless of the type of machinery you're going to use, you are going to cause more damage in those instances. I've worked with horse logging on ancient woodlands before now in the Lake District, and they still damage soil. They do regular routes. They have to do, if you're doing large areas you're working, they have to do lots of journeys up and down the same route, so they do cause damage as well. So there's no simple answer to that. I think, clear fell, yes, it looks drastic, but actually underneath the soil damage might be more minimal than doing continuous cover or other methods as well in circumstances.
You've already explained the fact that when you try to replace, say, larch or whatever trees with a mix broadleaf and conifers, etc., that the cost is much more expensive. Secondly, the returns are probably going to take longer to obtain. So If we wanted to see the kind of monoculture that there is in many plantations at present replaced with much more mixed woodland, what are the economics of that kind of replacement? And secondly, how can people be incentivised to replace ancient woodlands with much more widespread tree species?
I think what stops people wanting to be more diverse in terms of the broadleaf species and producing timber from broadleaf, so you get into that income generation from the broadleaves as we're used to, is the risk element of whether you can, what you invest over time will be realised. And the biggest impact to that, as we have mentioned, is deer and squirrels. So that's something at the moment which is really holding back landowners who want to change back to broadleaf perhaps, but retain some sort of income from their revenue from their woodlands.
Mr. Miller?
Yeah, I'm actually quite optimistic on this front. It is true at the moment that a lot of broadleaf woodland, the timber extracted from broadleaf woodlands goes for low-grade things like wood fuel, but the developments in timber technology are really quite exciting. So glulam is an example where you don't need a long straight timber beam to do construction anymore. You can produce composite materials, and I think the future for broadleaf woodlands will be that there will be a market for timber, even though it is not straight and long. So I'm really optimistic about that.
And is that kind of message? Because I suppose the easiest thing is to do what you've always done. So if you've always grown fir trees or whatever, then you'll always keep on doing that. So how is that message disseminated to those people who we've been told will be clearing woodlands over the next 5 years to ensure that we don't start another cycle of these kind of monoculture forests?
I think it's fair to say that all of the organisations represented at this session, the Forestry Commission, Confor, Woodland Trust, certainly the Institute of Chartered Foresters, are engaged in disseminating information, continuing professional development, seminars and courses. So we're trying, but there is also, because of that skills gap, the universities are working hard on bringing through a new cohort. The arrangement between the Forestry Commission and the University of Cumbria for a very successful apprenticeship scheme is fast-tracking people into the industry with new skills, I think. So there will be change. It takes time and investment, of course, but I think those skills are coming through into the industry. Of course, with continuing professional development, the challenge is that a sector of the industry engages with that, and there are harder to reach elements. But everybody's really trying hard to create a work base that is embracing a new kind of silvicultural challenge, I think.
I don't share your optimism. Now, I just look at my own constituency, even in government-owned land, where trees have been felled and already, 4 years on, the next batch of conifers are growing to kind of my height almost, and I think that tends to be the way in which, and really that's why I wanted to press you, what needs to be done to break out of that cycle?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to remember as well that beyond ancient woodland sites, we do need timber production. We are worried about environmental offshoring. We do need to think about the carbon benefits of trees as well. So it's context. I advocate for what's called a triad forestry approach, in which some of our woodlands are primarily for nature's recovery, some are more intensive plantations for timber production, and then there's a lot in the middle that is multi-objective forestry, mixed woodlands. The ancient woodlands sit very much in that nature's recovery section, but that doesn't mean to the exclusion of things that are focused more economically on producing profit and timber, but in a good environmental way. So if you like, I'm talking about the 30 by 30% would include the ancient woodlands, but we need that 70% to deliver for biodiversity, carbon and people, as well as produce timber.
And just one last question, Mr. Tubby, and maybe I picked you up wrongly when you were answering some of Chris's questions. It seemed to be that one of the things that you feared was that, first of all, if development got too close to woodland sites, and you outlined the difficulties that there were there, people using forest sites, etc., and the damage which they could do, either with their animals or just walking or fires or that kind of thing. But is one of the ways of protecting our woodlands not to make them more accessible to people, where they actually value them and where they become the people who, when development threatens them, they're the first to be out opposing the destruction of the woodlands. And I maybe I picked up wrongly, but I think to wrap them in cotton wool from the public is the wrong thing to do.
No, we absolutely want more people in woodlands, but we want them to be using those woodlands responsibly. So that's keeping your dogs on the lead and not fly tipping and all of these things. But yeah, getting more people in the woodland, I think, is very, very important. But as part of that, we need, I think, to try and help increase society's understanding of sustainable forest management and what it takes to manage a forest well and keep ecosystems thriving and biodiversity healthy. So I'm not saying keep people out of woodlands. That's not what I want to do at all. But it's making sure that people have access and infrastructure to enable them to use those woodlands responsibly, and certainly take things like starting fires accidentally from campfires and barbecues. All of that stuff just needs such a lot more, I suppose, awareness raising, so people really understand what their potential impact can be on a woodland if they're not acting responsibly within it. And what I'd really like to see in terms of woodland management and creation and development is some of the new towns that are being proposed. Why don't we turn those into forest towns? That's something that certainly my organisation and Natural England are quite keen on. So if we establish a new town, surround it by 1,000 hectares of new woodland, join up some of these ancient woodland fragments, build with timber and connect the new residents of that town with the environment that surround them and supporting them. So I think there's a huge amount we can do with public engagement and increasing the awareness of how to use woodland responsibly.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Davies.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you for joining us today. I do have some questions about government support for ancient woodland, but before I get to that, I just wonder if you have any reflections on why it would seem that we still don't have a handle on how much ancient woodland there is and where it is. I note in the Environmental Improvement Plan that there's an aspiration to have the inventory updated by 2027, but we've had a definition of ancient woodland since Natural England's predecessor organisation developed it in the 1980s, and we are relying on maps which go back to the 1600s. I know some of them will be hard to read and follow, but it would seem we don't have a proper handle on it, on where and the extent of these woodlands are. I'm not sure whether that's best answered by Mr. Tubby or Dr. Weatherall, or I'd be happy to.
I can go. It's a good question. I think the answer is partly that our understanding of ancient woodlands is changing. We're now incorporating ancient wood pasture as a habitat type, for example. We don't just rely on the maps. There are ecological indicators as well. So you may find that a woodland under threat is not classified or mapped as an ancient woodland, but if you do a survey, it's got plants in it or trees like small-leaved lime that suggest that it's an ancient woodland. So it's not as simple as looking at a map and saying it. It's quite an undertaking, although there's only about 360,000 hectares of ancient woodland in England. That's still a lot of ground to cover, plus the woodlands that we've not included in the first inventory to go and investigate if we now think that they're ancient. So resources can be a challenge for it. But my understanding is that Natural England, who've been leading on the inventory, are very close to publishing it now, and it will be better, more comprehensive than before. So, yeah.
I understand that the inventory is the responsibility for it sits with MHCLG and DEFRA. And this is quite a complicated space when you think about the interaction between woodland and the public bodies or government. Obviously, we've got DEFRA, as you'd perhaps expect, but then MHCLG, as I've mentioned, local authorities, Forestry Commission, Natural England, that could go on. There's lots of... It's quite a confused space. Do you think there's a lack of clarity as a consequence of there being so many people trying to manage it? Would it be better if just one organisation took more control?
I'm quite astonished by how many organisations and government departments you mentioned there. You clearly know more about this than I do. My understanding was that Natural England were...
more about it than you do.
My understanding was that Natural England were leading on it, and it's quite close to fruition. I don't know if my colleagues know more than me about that.
No, we're certainly working closely with Natural England on that, because it's in our interest to have a comprehensive understanding of where the ancient woodland is and what condition it's in.
Can the public help with the inventory?
Pardon?
Can the public help with it if they're enthusiasts? Or
I don't know if this is something that a citizen science type approach could help with or not, or if it is more reliance on looking at the indicator species that are present in existing woodland. I honestly don't know.
I love the idea of it, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that certainly, I think about my local area, there are people who would love to engage with an activity like that. But I know time is short, so I hope you don't mind if I just move on. In terms of government initiatives that there are to restore ancient woodland, what are they and how are they being delivered? And I know that the government, and correct me if I'm wrong, has an aspiration to create and restore 500 hectares of can't read my own writing, wildlife-rich habitat by 2050. I'd be grateful if you could tell me if that's correct, and also give me an assessment of how well we're doing, given that's 24 years away.
Well, can I come back straight away and say I think it's 500,000 hectares?
Oh, sorry, yeah, 500k I've written. 500,000.
Yeah, 500,000, and I think native woodland that's planted will outside designated sites will contribute to that target. Mm-hmm. So we're really aiming, what we want to achieve in England is long term somewhere around 10,000 hectares of woodland creation a year. Or
that will get us there, will it? Pardon my maths.
Well, that will do the woodland contribution towards that target. On top of that, there will also be the creation or restoration of other habitats as well, so maybe peat bog, heathland, and that type of thing. So overall, at the moment, and I should have, but haven't got in front of me, the stats for tree planting this year, but I'll confirm this with the committee afterwards. But I think we're around about 7,000 hectares a year of woodland.
We're not getting to that 10,000.
So we're still short of it, but the rate at which woodland creation has picked up in the last few years has been quite encouraging, and certainly at the moment I think around about 90% of the woodland that's being planted is native broadleaf species. Mm-hmm. So we're doing reasonably well on the nature recovery, and perhaps less well on creating woodlands for timber production and carbon and to hit net zero in the long term.
When I look at the environmental improvement plan, there's a number of recommendations in it, or the pieces of guidance in respect of ancient woodlands, but would you share my assessment that they feel a bit woolly? It just talks about improving the condition of ancient and semi-natural woodlands, and it talks about delivering on our commitment to enhance the biodiversity of all unrestored plantations on ancient woodland. But are there any meaningful measures by how government could be assessed for how it's helping make that happen?
Overall, I'm from a forestry perspective, I'm fairly pleased with where we got to with the environment improvement plan. And I think it sets us a decent kind of strategy or strategic objectives to try and reach over the next few decades. And one of the commitments in the EIP is to produce a tree action plan. And I think that will provide us with an opportunity to actually set out how we're going to deliver some of the ambitions and wider, maybe slightly woollier commitments that are in the EIP. But I think it sets a really good backdrop for the Trees Action Plan to build on now.
So to summarise, it's a good foundation, but it needs some more clarity about how it will be delivered. How will that come through? Will it be DEFRA that needs to bring that through?
DEFRA are leading the development of the Trees Action Plan at the moment. It's a live piece of work.
Well, I shall inquire as to how they're getting on, but Dr. Weatherall.
Yeah, I just wanted to support that, really, that yes, there are inevitably some statements in the Environment Improvement Plan that are, they're certainly not smart targets, let's put it like that, but we're hopeful as well that the Tree Action Plan will come through with more of the detail, and DEFRA are trying to consult with a wide range of stakeholders on that, so we look forward to seeing the results of that process.
I wonder if I might just, I know time is short, but bring you and Mr. Knight. Are you familiar with the Environmental Improvement Plan?
I'm not.
Okay, I just wondered if you had any thoughts about whether there was a tension there between the EIP's aims of protecting ancient woodland and some of your stakeholders who will no doubt want to increase timber production.
By the very nature of that, there will be.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's the bit that needs focusing on in terms of how that's approached over that time. All the things we've been talking about today really will have to be taken into account in order to move things forward to a place where the government may wish the country to be. Yeah.
I would just say that we need to do both. The Forestry Commission's sensitivity mapping has shown that there is, in the low risk sensitivity areas, there's about 10 times as much land available as the tree cover expansion target to 2050. So it's really about siting new productive woodlands in the right places that don't impact on things. It's not, restoration of ancient woodlands should not be seen as a loss of productive timber, because that should be the new planting should be going forward and doing that. It's not either or, it's both.
I think it's, if I may add to that, sorry, if I may just add to that, I think...
Yeah, very briefly, yeah.
Yeah, the woodland creation is a challenge. And it's becoming more of a challenge to get things through in terms of productivity for forests.
To get it through where?
To get it through regulators and to get plans through even both timescale, but also things get pushed through regulators and then they're challenged through courts. So something that might be given a project as a tick, several hundred hectares worth of mixed woodland might be stopped by the courts. So, it's nice to say we're going to boost the one with the other, but it's becoming increasingly more difficult to deliver that.
It seems an irony, because it feels like we spend a lot of time on this committee talking about planning restrictions and whether they get in the way of building homes. You're saying our planning restrictions are getting in the way of planting trees as well?
It's the perception of the woodland and land use change all comes into it, I think. EI regulations, yeah.
Thank you very much. Barry Gardner.
Dr. Weatherall, first of all, thank you so much for bringing these books.
Just one.
Just one. Well, right, we'll share it round. We'll fight over who gets it first. Yeah. But Mr. Tubby, you said you weren't familiar with the UK's temperate rainforests, so I will recommend a book to you, Guy Shrubsole's Britain's Lost Rainforests. But well worth a read. It's great.
You've not bought him one, though.
Well, if I'd known, if only I'd known. I wanted to... We're talking about ancient woodland, going back to 1600. Landowners don't live for 400 odd years. They die. They sometimes sell their land. And so I wanted to talk to you about, or get you to give us some ideas on the woodland Carbon Code and the credits, the offsets that are made under the Woodland Carbon Code. So you've got the pending issuance units, you've got the woodland carbon units. But because these are personal contracts with the landowner, if the landowner dies, if the landowner sells their land, they're gone. How do we overcome that? I know these aren't contributing to our national emissions, it's a private offsetting scheme, but it's one which is and can be very valuable for those wanting to plant and indeed restore ancient woodlands. So what recommendations should this committee be making to ensure that there is that continuity of the contract?
You go. Can I just pick up on Woodland Carbon Code? So the Woodland Carbon Code is it only applies to new woodlands that are being planted. So it's not a code that can be retrofitted onto an existing woodland.
But it is used for restoration projects of ancient woodland.
Not that we're aware of.
Yes, we have.
There you go.
Aerocor, I can't remember it's some funny name. Kiernar Croc already has done that in an estate in Scotland, so it may be a different regime slightly.
I think I'm aware of the project that you're referring to. Forestry is a devolved policy area, the Scottish Forestry are probably best placed to answer any details about the specific case. I think that was about establishing woodland perhaps where there once was, rather than restoring standing trees. So the Woodland Carbon Code only applies where you're planting a new woodland. So if the woodland was there 300 years ago and is cleared, and you're planting new trees, the Woodland Carbon Code applies to that.
So you could use that then. Let's say an ancient woodland had been damaged and a third of it had been lost in the way that you suggest. If you were planting new broadleaf species there to extend that woodland, would that not count under the Carbon Code?
Only the trees that you're planting.
Yeah, of course. That's part of a restoration project, isn't it?
I don't think it would. I think it's about tree cover expansion and the using of the word restore. I don't want to be rude about a project I don't know much about, but is a little bit of a marketing thing in that instance. Is a ghost woodland. It ceased to exist. I sound a little bit like Monty Python now, but yes, I don't think you would use it under the existing canopy, because the metrics in the Woodland Carbon Code to calculate the carbon aren't predicated on there being existing woodland cover there.
Right. So this is not going to help. As it stands, it would not be of use to help ancient woodland.
Okay.
In terms of the scheme itself, now putting ancient woodland to one side, how can we be more? What recommendations should the committee be making to ensure that these projects don't die with the landowner, as it were, or when it's sold on?
I know within the Woodland Carbon Code itself that there's been several examples of where land has changed hands once the woodland has been established and the trees have been planted. So having legal agreements that protect, I suppose, the financial arrangements around the sale of the carbon is very important. And I think there is some we've taken legal advice as the code has been developed. And the Woodland Carbon Code applies to England, Wales and Scotland, so the devolved administrations will continue to work together on that. The code also includes a buffer because what we don't want to happen is for the code to be viewed as a bit of greenwash and the carbon not really being there.
Exactly.
So the code itself is quite conservative when it comes to estimating the likely growth rate of the new woodland and hence the carbon it contains.
Well, you have those thresholds, as it were, for the PIUs and the WCUs.
Yes.
At 5 and 15 years.
That's right, and there's also it's not just a desk exercise. I believe there's on-site mensuration takes place to really give an accurate picture of the wood that's there.
I understand the security within the scheme. What I'm more concerned about is when the land is sold, because it's a personal contract. There is no obligation on the new landowner to continue and deliver that, and indeed there's no security of the sequestration of the carbon in perpetuity. Yes, sir.
I feel that we're trying to answer on something that we possibly don't have the expertise to get exactly right for you. What I can recommend is that although it is across the 3 countries, it's led out of Scottish Forestry, and Pat Snowden in Scottish Forestry is the best person to talk to, and I'm sure he'd be willing to submit a written response to you about it to clarify it.
Thank you very much. Just finally, Mr. Tubby, Forestry Commission, 3 principles that you operate to: management, production, and conservation. Do you believe that the Forestry Commission has got those in the right balance?
Looking back kind of over the last quarter of a century, I think perhaps we haven't. So with woodland creation, we've planted around about 77,000 hectares of broadleaf woodland and only about 4,000 hectares of conifer woodland. We've also lost, I think, around about 40,000 hectares of conifer woodland. For good reasons, where we're restoring habitat and bringing monocultural plantations up to UKFS, UK Forestry Standard specification. And as I say, I feel that we're making good progress, or reasonably good progress, towards the nature recovery targets when it comes to planting native broadleaves. I think the difficulty we're having at the moment is we've not found the right combination of incentives and to unlock more land for some of the more productive, faster growing species we need for timber security and to help hit net zero. So that's kind of a policy gap that I think we need to try and grasp. And the other thing I think I'd like to see, and it is coming, I feel that over the last few years the focus has been very much on woodland creation. And we mustn't forget the 1.3 million hectares of woodlands out there already that's storing all of that carbon, are providing all of that habitat. So we really need, I think, to carry on doing what we're doing with woodland creation when it comes to broadleaves, turn the dial up a little bit on conifer, and also certainly turn the dial up on managing that existing resource.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, Mr. Knight, Mr. Tubby and Dr. Weatherall, thank you very much indeed for that, which brings this session to a close. This sitting is suspended. Order.